Hello and welcome back to Animated Literacy. Again, my name is Jim Stone and I am the creator of Animated Literacy. In the first session, we took a look at the role that emotion plays in attention and in memory, and we also looked at the role that prior knowledge plays in memory. And so in keeping with that, we're going to be taking a look at the last 150 years of reading instruction so that we can access our prior knowledge about how reading has been taught, and then look at ways that we can improve upon those methods that have been around for some time. As you'll notice as we're going along, I'm presenting a lot of quotes from some of the very top researchers in brain research, language research, and in reading research. My hope is that both this helps to validate the things that I'm saying, but also to give you the opportunity that if you wish to dive deeper into the research, you can go to the same sources that I've used so that you can gain a greater understanding of how children learn and what is needed for children to be a successful reader and writer, and the stages that we go through when we're acquiring a new language. This is a quote from 2005 in Reading Research Quarterly from James Cunningham. And he tells us that for almost a century and a half, graded or leveled texts were generally considered an important, if not essential, component of elementary reading instruction. Unfortunately, as he points out, little is known about the contribution of text to early reading instruction. So while we've been using these little simplified books for well over 150 years now, there's been very little research to find out if that's actually the best way to teach reading. I want to remind you of a quote that we looked at last time, where Marion Diamond tells us that the brain is only as smart as it needs to be, and that if we don't place children in challenging environments, their brain will not get bigger and brighter and more proficient. And if we place them in an environment that is too low, then the brain can't grow, and in fact, in severe situations, the brain can actually shrink. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're taking a look at the kinds of books that have been used for 150 years to teach reading. The first set of reading textbooks that came out was probably the McGuffey Reader. The McGuffey Reader was first published in about 1840. We don't have any surviving editions of the 1840 McGuffey Reader, but we do have books that came out in the 1880s. And so this is an example of an 1881 McGuffey Reader. Now, McGuffey Reader started out with just a few words, a and cat, rat. Then it took a look at the letters that spell those words and the sounds that those letters represent. So we had a, e, d, n, r, and t. Then they put those into words. So the child was to read a rat, a cat, a rat, and then it was put into a longer phrase, a cat and a rat and a cat. After completing lesson number 1, lesson number 2 introduced just a few more words, at, the, ran, has, and it introduced the letters H, TH, and S. So now the children were to read the rat, the cat has a rat, the rat ran at Anne has a cat, the cat ran at the rat. Then as we progress on to lesson number 3, we have the words gnat, hat, fan, can, and children are just introduced to the sound and the shape of the letter F. So now they can read a fan, a hat, and the children read Anne and Nat. Anne has a fan, Nat has a hat, and can fan Nat. And as you notice, this is very unnatural language, so I keep stumbling even though I've read that many, many different times. These books didn't go away. They keep coming back. In today's world, this type of reading is known as decodable text. So this is what McGuffey Reader was doing from about 1840 to about 1940. Our daughter was born in 1982, and so she went to kindergarten when she was 5 years old in 1987. She had a bedroom full of books, and she dearly loved being read to. Then when she went to school, she was handed a book that read like this. Dan can fan, Dan can fan Jan, can Chan fan Dan. She brought that book home. She sat her mother and me down on the bed, and she read it perfectly to us. Once she demonstrated she could read that book, she put it down on the bed and she said, "Dad, why do they write like that?" She was quite insulted that she had this bedroom filled with books that had emotion, that accessed her prior knowledge, and that she loved to read over and over and over again once she developed the ability to actually read the books. But long before that, she was memorizing the books. We had a flashlight in our home that was always in one location in case the power went out. That flashlight disappeared. We hunted for 2 weeks to find it, and no one would admit that they knew where it was. But we found it in Kimberly's bed because we would go in, we would read her books, and she wanted the same story over and over and over again. So we had read that book so many times that she could memorize it, take out the flashlight, and read herself to sleep. Then at that same time, as she was beginning to mature, she was exposed to animated literacy. And so I have experience working with a child at home with animated literacy as well as with students in the classroom, and I know the videotape is set up for both audiences, for parents who are teaching their children at home as well as teachers who are teaching remotely or in the classroom. So as she was being read to from these bedtime stories, we began to teach her the sounds of language. So McGuffey Reader is using decodable text to teach phonics. Now, we know through lots of research that children need to learn phonics, but there isn't research to say that using little decodable books is the best way to do it. And in fact, this is a quote from the National Reading Panel that came out in 2000, where it tells us that surprisingly very little research has attempted to determine the contribution of decodable books to the effectiveness of phonics. So even back at that time, I was beginning to try to sequence animated literacy to match the way children learn to speak. And when children are learning to speak, when they can only speak 1 or 2 words, it's estimated that they're comprehending probably in the neighborhood of 50 words. When they can speak about 50 words, they're comprehending 5- and 6-word sentences. So their comprehension is way up at a high level, while their production is down at a much lower level, and we need to support both that input, those output and input levels. So when we read to children, we're doing as Marian Diamond suggested and creating an environment for children to grow into. Then when we drop back and teach them how to decode words by using sounds and letters, then we can start to work on word recognition. So we were doing that with Kimberly as I was developing the program. So she was learning about a character who has a song and a story named Baby Barnaby, who bounces and bends and balances and plays banjo, and as everyone's clapping for him, he bows to his audience. And so when we think of Baby Barnaby, or we think of the letter B, we think of bowing and we go, buh. Then she learned about Old Joe Crow, and Old Joe Crow is rowing his boat home. So if you are pretending to be Old Joe Crow, you put your arms out, you take hold of the 2 oars of the boat, and you pull back and give a great big groan and go, oh! And then she learned about Timmy Tiger. And Timmy Tiger is here tickling terrible Tommy T-Rex's tummy. So whenever we think about Timmy Tiger, we wiggle our fingers in front of our tummy and we go t. Now if we put those 3 sounds together, so we have b, oat. Now we can read the word boat. And then she had a box of toys that represented all of the sounds and all of the spelling patterns in the English language, so she could match that word to a boat. Then she learned very early that if you replace the B in boat with Crazy Camel sound, and here's Crazy Camel, and she catches cookies and cakes and candies and cashews that bounce up in the air, so she learns to go k. So now if you change boat by replacing the k, the b sound at the beginning with k, then you have coat. And then she was also learning that if you have the B sound and you follow it with Irving, and here's Irving, and he's on his scooter, and he's turning the steering wheel very quickly, and as he turns that wheel, the tires go, and then you put Daisy Dragon sound at the end, and here's Daisy Dragon, and she's dancing at the dairy, or you can dance like this. And if you put all 3 of those sounds together, you have b, bird. And when you blend that, you can match it to the toy bird that she had. So through the use of those sounds, she was learning to read words, and not only just to read words, but to be able to spell words. So we had up on the refrigerator when she was in preschool our shopping list. And if we needed something from the store, we'd say, Kimberly, go to the list and write down the word. Now, when she wrote the word, she knew the sound and she knew many different ways to spell it. So she might spell it with an O-E, an O-A, an O-L, and various different ways. When she needed the sound of she might spell it I-R one time, E-R another time, and U-R another time. So her words were written phonetically, but they were not written the way the dictionary spells those words. But she saw the power of written language, because if she put enough sounds on the card, we went to the store and the article came home. If she didn't write it so that we could read it, then we didn't buy what was on the list. So she was seeing very early the power of reading. So that's how we approached teaching her about phonological awareness and teaching about phonics. After about 100 years of the McGuffey Reader, from around 1840 to 1940, the next major change in reading instruction came. This was called the whole word approach with the Dick and Jane Reader. So now children were instructed not to break words down into sounds and blend the sounds and letters together to form a word, but instead to simply memorize a word by its appearance. So the first word that they learned here was the word look. Then on the next page, that word was repeated. So the child reads look, look. Then on the next page, they have their second word, oh, so that's repeated, oh, oh, oh. And then on the following page, the two words are combined. So we have oh, 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 look. And then we have a new word, Jane. So again, as children were learning to read, they were now not supposed to sound words out. They were simply supposed to memorize whole words. This is what I had when I went to school, and I'm quite dyslexic, and I struggled with reading until my junior year of college when I finally figured out how to read well. I was presenting up in Toronto some years back, and at the very first break, a whole group of teachers came up to me en masse, and they told me that they were all teachers of the deaf. And because deaf children can't hear sounds unless they've received cochlear implants, they were not able to learn to read by combining sounds with letters to decode words. So instead, they were taught sight words. And what's typical when children are taught sight words is they progress quite well for up until about 3rd to 4th grade. Once they hit 4th grade, their sight word vocabulary tops out as words are coming at them faster and faster. And the pictures in the books are taken away from them, so they don't have that kind of assistance to figure out the words. And in many cases, they hit what's termed the 4th grade slump, and they can't advance beyond 4th grade. The next major change in reading instruction came after the 1972 publication of the American Heritage Word Frequency Book. The Word Frequency Book tells us that the word the represents about 7.3% of all of the words in print. So if you were only taught to read the word the, you'd be able to read just over 7% of any book you take off the shelf. If you add the word the, that represents almost 3% of all the words in print, and you put 7 and 3 together, those two words represent about 10% of all the words in print. If we add 5 more words, and, a, to, in, is, with only 7 words, you can read about 20% of any book in print. With a total of 20 words, you can read about 30% of any book in print. And with only 50 words, you can read about 40%. And as that expanded out, with just over 100 words, you could read half of any book. So now publishers decided, let's teach children to read those words first. And so if we can teach them to memorize 100 words, they'll be able to read half of any book. So this was the most popular pre-primer in the United States back at that time, and it was very popular in the late 80s and early 90s. It's called Bears. And so it reads like this. They replaced the nouns with pronouns because pronouns are used much more often than nouns in our speaking and in our reading. So the first page reads, I will go. The second page reads, I will go, will you go, I will go. The next page reads, we will go, will you go, I will not go. And the next page reads, we will go, you go, I will not go, I will go in. And so continuing to write stories like that, children were to learn those 100 most frequently written words. A different form of this came out with the Open Court, and this is from their 2000 edition of Open Court. And here they put in high frequency words, and instead of replacing nouns with pronouns, they replaced nouns with pictures. So the child was to read the high frequency words and then simply name the picture. So here's a story called What Do We See? And then the children were to read We See a, and then name the giraffe. So we see a giraffe. On the next page, they read We see 2 elephants. And on the next page, they read We see 3 zebras. So children are being very directly trained to look at the pictures to help them guess the words. That went even further with another method of reading instruction. In our McGuffey Reader, children were to sound out words. In Dick and Jane, they were to memorize words. Now we had a new form of reading instruction where children were not to sound out or simply memorize words. Instead, they were to use the context of the pictures and of the words that they did know to guess the words that they didn't recognize. And so here, the teacher might read to the children the title of the story, Things That Go. The teacher could read the first 2 pages. The car can go, the train can go, and there's a picture of a car and a train. And then on the next page, there's a picture of a boat, and the children are then asked, what do you think that page says? And if they know the pattern and they look at the boat, they can read the boat can go. Now, what all of these books have in common is they're all simplifying language to a very low level. This is a quote that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's precisely what's been happening as we've continued for over 150 years to use these simplified little books. So a question we then need to ask ourselves is, do simple books or challenging books provide the best learning environment? Timothy Shanahan is one of the most respected reading researchers out there today, and he has a blog where he takes a look at research and he takes a look at methods, and he tells you in his blog whether in fact those methods are truly research-based. Here he tells us that it wasn't until 2000 when anyone bothered to examine the value of instructional level using randomized control trials. So those little books really weren't looked at scientifically until after 2000. Those studies found either that it made no difference whether kids were matched to texts or whether kids were reading at what was called their instructional level, or the frustration level kids, the kids who were given more challenging books, far outperformed the instructional level ones. So in a best case scenario, those little books made no difference in helping children read. But in many cases, they held kids back because the kids who were reading challenging books instead of simple books were doing far better. Jean Shaw is one of the leading researchers in reading for many, many years, and she coined the phrase the 4th grade slump. She tells us that many children who appear to be doing well in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, when they have a lot of pictures to support their reading and the text is very simple and predictable, end up hitting 4th grade and suddenly their progress stops and they may graduate high school still reading at that 4th grade level. She tells us the 4th grade slump is worse among poor children because they are not exposed to a vocabulary-rich environment. She recommended that teachers expose young readers to a variety of rich, engaging texts that teach vocabulary along with decoding skills. And that's precisely what we were doing with our daughter from the time she was very young. She was hearing bedtime stories that had rich vocabulary and sentence structures and challenging books to grow into, while at the same time we were using the animated alphabet, animated literacy characters to teach sounds, provide her with gestures to remember the sounds, and then blending those sounds together to read and write the names of her toys and our shopping lists. I was traveling through Denver some years ago to present a workshop, and as I looked at the headline in the newspaper, it said, "Students Stay Stuck." And here was a picture of one administrator with his head in his hands and another wringing his hands. And the article said a majority of Colorado students who scored unsatisfactory on reading tests as third graders remained in the lowest category as fifth graders. So this supports what Gene Shaw was talking about. Keith Stanovich, who is considered by many to be the top researcher in reading, if not one of the top, tells us that there are two basic things children need to become successful with if they're going to avoid that fourth grade slump and become independent, fluent readers and writers. The first thing he tells us is that phonological awareness facilitates decoding skill. Phonological awareness is not phonics, it's not letters, it's strictly sounds. So it's auditory rather than visual. Phonological awareness determines word recognition. So one of the two things that Stanovich insists we have to be good at is word recognition, and the foundation of that is phonological awareness, which in conjunction with listening comprehension determines reading comprehension. So the two things we need to be working on are listening comprehension, which comes from our bedtime stories and reading literature that is challenging for children and includes lots of vocabulary, while at the same time teaching them to decode, which is precisely what we were doing with our daughter, and I was doing the same thing with my students in the classroom. Stanovich is famous for the term the Matthews effect, which comes from a biblical term, where he tells us when it comes to reading, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Students with, and the key word here is automatic, word recognition skills continue to advance in school, while struggling readers read less, comprehend less, causing them to fall further and further behind. This is supported by research that came out in Becoming a Nation of Readers back in 1985, one of the first federal documents to actually start using reading research, where again, they tell us that poor readers have barely mastered spelling to sound patterns, whereas good readers have a command that goes beyond simple mastery to automaticity. So they don't have to think about it. Sounding out words becomes automatic. They go on to say failure is not fun. Predictably, poor readers have unfavorable attitudes towards reading. Knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do. And Shanahan helps us to understand this. Shanahan tells us that good readers recognize words by translating letters to phonemes, and poor readers are stuck relying on the pictures and context to do the best they can. And here we have a lot of students who are being directly trained to look at pictures rather than letters and sounds to figure out the words. He says, I do not support the idea of teaching students to read like poor readers who rely on the pictures. The result of all of this is very tragic. We're told that 7 out of 10 adult prisoners can't read above a 4th grade level. Almost 85% of teenagers in the juvenile justice system are functionally illiterate, and dropouts make up 90% of Americans on welfare. Again, as I was traveling through an airport, I picked up a copy of USA Today, and it was talking about students in Delaware, where it said nearly half of all the 3rd graders in Delaware cannot read at grade level. A child who can read at grade level by 3rd grade is 4 more times as likely to graduate on time as a child who cannot read at grade level in 3rd grade. In 4th grade, it tells us only 37% of the students in Delaware were reading at grade level in 2015, compared to the national average of 36%. So they were pretty much right there at the national average. So in our next section, we're going to be taking a look at the difference between little books and the kinds of books that parents read to their children, and looking to see what we can do to provide children with instruction that helps them avoid that fourth grade slump and become lifelong readers and learners. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next session.